theory we should start now, but given the fact that we are at the end of a coffee break, I'm not sure what to do. Maybe we still start because everything's a bit tight. We have 4 speakers, and I want to give everybody proper room to present their work and also do Q&A. Okay, my name is Ronald. I'm the sort of the PC chair for the academic paper sessions. As some people know, we do this every year. There's an open call for papers, so do submit papers for next year. And this year we had 41 papers in total, which is a lot. I mean, we're on the rise. 27 papers were written by junior researchers, and that would be PhD students or even master students. And there were 14 papers written by more senior researchers. This is actually quite a huge operation, so we have 110 reviews in total done by 31 reviewers, so everybody put in a lot of effort, and I think we got a fair amount of comments on the paper, so that will help improve the papers further. And the acceptance rate this year was very quality, so we have accepted 18 papers out of the 41. So we got to be picky this year more than ever. So I'm very pleased so we've 4 sessions. This is the first one, and tomorrow there will be 2 others, and after this one will be the second one for today. We have 4 speakers. There's not really a theme in this batch. That happens if you have an open call, so we will hear about totally different topics, and it will be fun. Okay, so we will start with Felix Ritchie, who is an associate professor of applied economy at the University of West England in Bristol, if I'm correct. I mean, part of it is at least there. And he will sort of argue that we have to move away a bit from policing approach to data security, and therefore replace it with something else. But that's what Felix is going to talk about. Okay, so and what we'll do is every speaker has about 18 minutes, so we do up to 15 minutes or so presentation, and then questions and answers for that presentation, and then move on to the others. Okay? Good. Felix.
Okay. Is it okay if I stand? Can you first stand and talk? Okay, I'll try and keep it down to about 10 minutes, but I've got to raise the ideas and get some discussion. My co-author Ritchie is down in front as well, so he can share the blame. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is what we might call the human factor in data access. We've both worked in data access for quite a long time, trying to persuade particularly government departments to improve the way that they make data available for researchers. One of the things we've spent quite a lot of effort in is trying to move people away from a fear-based approach to an evidence-based approach, and looking at how people actually use research, what they do with that data. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Cut very simply to the end result is that essentially, let's say, non-confidential data to be used for research is a good thing. Okay? Generally, the data is there, it would be a good thing to use it. The biggest problem with doing that is the people who are doing research. Okay, there are technology problems and all sorts of other issues, but essentially people are at the middle of this problem. Putting a policeman in charge of data access is a good and simple way to do anything. Okay, people understand it, it's nice and straightforward, it's very popular, it's very easy to do, and it's very clear who's in charge, who's at fault when things go wrong. What we're going to suggest is actually putting more effort into trying to get the researchers to share the same perspective as you. Brings many more benefits. So we're going to use a specific example. We're looking at access to government data for research. This is our particular area of speciality. So this is the sort of information collected sometimes by statistical agencies, but it might also be the tax department, it might be the social security, administrative data. All sorts of information is collected. This has a high reuse value. There's lots of things you could be doing with that data, and because the data has already been collected, there's a lot of investment in collecting that data, relatively low costs of reusing that, so potentially a very large benefit. Access is generally granted to this under statute. So you have the research gateways in the laws that cover this. So there's no consent discussion here. Data owners tend to benefit relatively little from this. Government departments will give you access to data, but often they don't see much of the benefit from this. Even, for example, the tax department in the UK, which is required to show that they actually get something out of this research, it's very difficult to show how some of that directly benefits them. And there's a theoretical environment around us which is almost exclusively based on fear. Fear, worst case scenarios, thinking of everything that could possibly go wrong, then writing this up. Now, there are good reasons for that when we're considering the academic purpose. However, when you come to put this into practice, this is not a good way to think about planning data access. So, default option, policing strategy. You tell people what to do. Come in here, receive this file, do this or that, do that with it, don't lose it, don't give it to your neighbour, don't do procedures in a way other than the way I've told you. And you say, if you get it wrong, you're in trouble. I'll take you to court, I'll get you fired, I'll do something easy, straightforward, it's familiar, it's very clear who is responsible if anything goes wrong. And one of the consequences of that, it immediately creates a barrier. You say, we're the policeman, you're the one who's potentially the trouble, okay, so we're going to keep an eye on you. It creates an immediate barrier between you and a researcher. So, as a researcher, what's your perspective? I've been told to do something, but they don't trust me. Why should I trust them? Why should I support them? Okay. The problem is, when we look at this in government data access, again, 50 years of data access in the UK, detailed, microdata, some of it quite sensitive data, no evidence whatsoever of an intruder. Researchers do things. They do stupid things. They ignore procedures. They make mistakes. There's lots of these sorts of cases. We know about these things. However, to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be advising you on this, I've never come across an accredited researcher who is trying to re-identify data. Okay, they've been given research access to data, they've tried to say, who can I identify from that data? So lots of mistakes, lots of users doing stupid things, typically because they don't like the way their environment is organised, they don't like the rules. But raise the question then, if you've got this all set up, you don't trust the users, you continually look out to see what they're doing, and they make these mistakes, I mean, why are you giving them access to this data? You know, it sounds rather a sort of negative situation. You don't trust them, you don't give them any freedom, they don't respond to that by saying, well, they don't trust me, why do I care? Lo and behold, mistakes happen, and people do the wrong thing. Let's try plan B. We're going to what we call legitimacy. There's a lot of work in an organisational theory, what's called organisational legitimacy. And the idea is that the way that things, people see that they are part of an organisation, or they're part of a community, and they can understand the goals and the purposes of that community, they're much more likely to go along with this. For example, this is now taking hold quite a lot in police organisations. It started in the US, and now it's taken up quite a lot in the UK. The idea is that if, for example, people don't trust the police, they don't respect the police, they're not going to do the right thing. You know? We delegate authority to the police force. You know, we want to say we created a police force because we think there should be someone, an independent, objective organisation, which can make sure that the law is obeyed. If we don't trust the organisation to do that, why should we go on obeying the laws? We don't think other people are going to do it. We don't think the law is going to be enforced fairly. Okay? And as I said, this has taken off quite a lot in the policing community. The basic idea is then that we're all in this together. We have some shared goals. In the case of data security, what we all want is we want people to be using this data, producing research, doing it safely. Haven't said anything about how it's going to be done, but we can all agree the main aim is to get this data used for research and be able to do it safely. We share a responsibility. It's not me telling you what to do, and if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. If something goes wrong, maybe it's because I've designed systems that actually make it easy for you to do the wrong thing. Or maybe you just weren't listening when I asked you to do something, you didn't understand, and you decided to do your own thing. Whatever the thing is, it's a shared responsibility, because if either of us do something wrong, we're both in trouble. Okay? We both know what we want to achieve. We both know if one of us does something wrong, we both suffer. Let's not just say, if you do something wrong, it's your fault, because I'm going to suffer as well. Okay? So it's very much we're working together. And one of the things that leads to is self-policing. We can talk through examples of this afterwards, but I mean, between us we did decide we got more examples between us of self-policing in the community than we have people doing the wrong thing. And this can include things like people off their own bat deciding to give additional training to junior researchers to make sure that the junior researchers don't do the wrong thing. People shopping each other, thinking you're doing the wrong thing. I'm going to tell the people in charge because I don't want you to damage my access. Okay? Lots of examples like this. Because people know it's better if we do these little things and make sure the system all runs. Because if something goes wrong, we're all in trouble. What that leads to, lower costs, better security. It does need a bit more investment. It needs a lot more work because this is not just saying, I'm going to give you more information, tell you better about how to work in this environment. It involves quite a lot of effort in actually making sure you've properly engaged people in what you're doing. And it's a complete system. From the point someone makes an application to use the data, thinking about how they can use it, all the way to they produce the research outputs, you need to be thinking about how are they going to engage with you. One key point is that risks are explicit and they're shared. We moved away from this policeman world where essentially I say, I've set up the rules, great, so there's my risk done. If anything goes wrong, it's that person's fault. We're much more clear about we all make mistakes. Things can go wrong. Let's be grown-ups about this. Okay? Things can happen. The problem is, if mistakes happen, we need to identify those mistakes, sort them, make sure they don't happen again. Let's move on. Okay? And if someone is, for example, repeatedly doing the wrong thing, can we design our systems better to stop that happening? Okay? So we're much more explicit about the risks. So the aim of this is we need to actively change attitudes. We also need to change the attitudes of the data holders as well. So the policeman approach is really popular amongst data owners because they don't see much benefit. So a lot of the effort, particularly when setting up these sorts of systems, is going to the people who hold the data and say, look, if you actually treat your researchers as grown-ups, rather than as children who must be told what to do, I can show you'll get a better benefit. You get better security, you get more engagement, and ideally you get lower costs out of this as well. But it's quite a hard argument to make. So, our evidence, and I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, is that when we're looking at, for example, data enclaves, which are the most extreme examples of where people have lots of opportunities to do the wrong thing, and it's very expensive, but if you get it right, you can save a lot of money. We get lower costs, higher output, better security, and we get really positive feedback from researchers. Researchers like the fact that they're actually being treated as partners in the arrangement, rather than as being potential criminals who must be always watched. Okay. So, is it a risk-free solution? It's obviously not. The point is, though, is we're being much more sensible about risk. We're saying, you know, that there are risks from people deliberately doing things. There are also risks from mistakes. Okay, let's use evidence. Let's think about what we know about what goes wrong, and see if we can design systems which are rather better and which actually reflect what people do, rather than saying, well, potentially, I could have an intruder in there whose only aim for the last 10 years of their life has been to get a degree in social statistics so that they can get access to my data and then look up their neighbour. The more realistic thing is someone gets bored or doesn't like the way I've done something and just decides to do something alternative. That's the real risk which we should concentrate on. Just very briefly, one thing we focus quite a lot on when thinking about these things is the way we could put models of providing access to data together, and we tend to think in terms of 5 aspects of security. Projects people are using, the data they've got access to, the environment which they use, the sort of outputs they're producing, because potentially outputs could be risky as well, but right in the middle of the bit, people. Because if you can't work the people, everything else becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. Those of you who are involved with designing IT systems, for example, okay, if you can get people to work in the way that you want them, you don't need to design IT systems which are based around the assumption that people are going to do the wrong thing. That's it.
That leaves us indeed with some time for questions. Anyone? Okay, then I'll give it a shot. Okay, so I'm involved in a program where we have NRENs. Those are the academic internet service providers, basically. They sit on a lot of traffic network data that is being requested by security researchers in order to do analysis on those data. That's similar to your government open data kind of thing. And you said that researchers don't re-identify, and therefore they have the proper mindset. But what we run into in this case is that computer scientists also have the proper mindset, but they also don't fully understand what privacy is, what data protection is, and what the risks are, etc. So they're asked to provide a sort of a research plan. This is what I want to do, and this is how I'm going to handle the data, and this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to disclose. And then still, what typically happens is that you have publications in which basically the single individual can be identified on the basis of the paper. And this has happened. So there was an Iranian homosexual that was identified on the basis of the network data, and this guy potentially got into serious trouble in Iran. So what I get from your story is that okay, we have to treat people as grown-ups and make them jointly responsible for what they're doing, but how do you cope with sort of educating the researchers in what is sort of the right behavior? Is that not a huge part of the effort?
And that's the thing is that when I said it's low cost, because generally I think it is, but it does involve more effort, and it's quite hard work to actually change attitudes, because you're not just giving someone a new set of instructions, you're actually trying to change the way so that they think differently. Yesterday I was down at the UK Data Archive and I was evaluating their new training program that they developed. And what one of the trainers said to the potential researchers said, we want you to think about security in the same way as we do. And that's quite hard because people quite understand security is important, but they don't think about things the other way. But often what we do is we teach them, or we tell them about things from, for example, from a statistical perspective, from an IT perspective. We tell them all things that can go wrong. We tell them in detail, for example, about laws. I saw someone who presented a presentation to encourage people to be safe researchers, and it has 7 slides about different legal frameworks which governed what that person could or couldn't be doing. Actually, there was only one slide, which basically, here's the information, do what you said you're going to do with it. If you've got anything else, come and ask us a question, and we're on your side, because if you break the law, we're all in trouble. So that's a sort of change in thinking to thinking, well actually, maybe they need to know about this law, but actually what they really need to do is understand the concepts. So it's that refocusing your attitude. But in trying to take your point, it is difficult. The other thing is you're also being grown up about what can go wrong. So in these sorts of environments, we do know things go wrong. We know that people do the wrong thing. We know quite a lot of people make mistakes. Even in, for example, these very secure environments, we've got lots of training. We tell people off occasionally. Things we never told anyone off twice for the same issue, because usually you go around and you explain to them and say, this is why this is what you've done is a problem. But it's also recognizing that mistakes happen. One of the problems with the fear-based is if you worry about everything, you make yourself a policeman, then you put all the blame on the researcher, and at that point you almost absolve your responsibility, because you say, well, if they've done something wrong, it's clear what was wrong. And that means, to some extent, you still say, okay, I can sit back and relax now. In this case, you're being much more explicit, saying, if you or I, together, we need to get this sorted. So if you're any uncertain about this, come back and ask us.
I will definitely ask you about more guidance in there, but okay, so one...
I want to ask you, do you think the size of the group of researchers would matter in determining which kind of governance mechanism is appropriate?
In terms of actually engaging people, initially, then you need to do it in small groups. One of the issues which we're trying to struggle with now is how do you get engagement from people who actually don't, for example, have a chance to see them and talk to them. So independently, we're both trying to develop programs which will actually try and get the same sort of engagement from people where literally all they have is a piece of paper to read and it has some information on that, and the organisation that starts from me to do this and Ritchie to do that is essentially saying we'll never see these people. I want to give them something to read that gets them to change the way that they think, and that's something which we're trying to do. Hopefully we'll achieve it, but it is quite a struggle. So it is something which you need to think about. What I want people to know, and how can I get that information across? And trying to get this off as a mass message is quite difficult. That's the next stage of what we're trying to do. In terms of small groups, it's reasonably well established what you need to do to get people to change their attitudes, because between us we've been doing this for about 10 years.
Just going to add to that, I think the way we manage the group of researchers that we manage, they tend to work in disciplines which themselves are small communities. Felix is an applied labour economist. In the UK we only have a small number of labour economists. So if one person is kind of excluded from the group accessing the data, all of their colleagues are going to know why. And that's why self-policing is, that Felix has talked about, is quite effective actually. But it's an interesting point actually if you keep increasing the size of the group, where you actually, the community doesn't know each other anymore, then it might not be so effective. But we haven't found that so far, at least with access to the really sensitive data.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here because we have 3 more rounds. Very interesting stories. I'd like to thank Felix for the. Okay, next one up is a paper written by a small group, so they know each other, and we get to know them from the paper. Yeah, so it's written by Felten, Joanna, Huey, and Arvind Narayanan. That's always difficult for me to pronounce. Joanna is going to do the presentation, and she is the Associate Director of the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton. She has a rich history which you can find on the internet, of course, at the CPDP site. And she's going to talk about how to do big data responsibly and with, yeah, okay. The rest is up to her. You want to
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also wanted to say thank you to the organizers in general, and also to my co-authors, Ed and Arvind, who both work with me at CITP. Our paper focuses on privacy violations that stem from re-identification of released data sets. So I'm sort of coming at this from a little different angle than Felix did. To start, I'd like to give you a sense of the problem with a recent example. Last year, in I guess early in the year, the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission released data on over 173 million taxi rides. After seeing a comment on Reddit, this fellow named Vijay Pandarangan noticed that the taxi license numbers and medallion numbers had been anonymized purely by hashing them. Once he realized this, it took about an hour for him to re-identify the entire data set, meaning that he could see where particular cabs went and what the fares were that they earned. So he could find out where the drivers were going and how much they were making. A few months later, Anthony Tokar noted that there were also privacy implications for passengers. So he had 2 different examples. One, he took photos of celebrities. He saw celebrities who got into cabs so he could find out where they were getting into a cab and the cab number. And then he found their trip and was able to find out where they went and also how much they tipped, which was a PR scandal for some of them. Another example that he used, which shows that he has a pretty good instinct for how to get the mainstream media interested in a data privacy blog post, was frequent visitors to Larry Flint's Hustler Club. So he looked for these trips that had the same endpoints. One endpoint was the club, and the other endpoint was likely to be the home or workplace of the visitor. So these are fairly sensational examples, but they lead me to a couple of central and general points that I want to focus on during this talk. First is that technological capabilities and assessments change over time. So yes, it's true. Right now, a simple hash of data is known to be a bad way to try to anonymize things, and the NYC Taxi Commission was correctly criticized for using this. But this kind of data set could have been released at a time when that was an accepted privacy protecting measure. And if it had been released then, there wouldn't have been that criticism, and data would still be around now, and it would still be easily re-identifiable. Second, privacy can be deeply impacted by auxiliary information. So a stalker who sees someone get into a cab and can find that data, or someone who has access to GPS information, can get a lot more, can extract a lot more out of the taxi data set than you would initially think. Both of these points lead me to the conclusion that privacy from de-identification can erode over time. As you get better re-identification tools, and as more data becomes public, things that once were not possible to re-identify can become possible to re-identify. And because data sets once released can't be taken back, data gets increasingly vulnerable as time passes. It's this erosion of privacy that we seek to address. And we do three basic things in the paper. We review the problem of re-identification. We advocate for research into protocols and systems that have proven privacy properties. And we offer some practical suggestions for improved protection from re-identification. I'll talk a little bit about each of these points in turn, though I will try not to go over my time. We can split re-identification threats into two basic categories: broad attacks and targeted attacks. Broad attacks seek to get as much information as possible about as many people as possible. So an adversary there could be someone who wants to get comprehensive records and sell them to a third party. A targeted attack picks out a particular person within a data set, and there an adversary could be someone like an employer who wants to get illicit help information about someone who's thinking about hiring. As I mentioned before, having these emerging re-identification techniques can increase the rate of broad privacy violations. So adversaries at the time of data release may not be able to re-identify, or they may need to be really smart or to have a lot of money in order to be able to do that. But tools will get more widespread, more information will become public, and these later adversaries will still have access to that data. Another problem is that current de-identification methods don't work with high-dimensional data, data sets that have lots of different data points for each individual record. And the problem is that more and more data sets are becoming high-dimensional data sets. If you think about social networking data or genetic data, those are going to be high-dimensional, and that trend is just going to continue as it gets cheaper to store information and easier to keep more and more information about particular individuals. So targeted attacks, the other kind that I mentioned, are often less acknowledged in the literature, but they're still important because people can know people and want to find out information about them. And the canonical example of this type of attack comes from some research by Sweeney. In 1997, she was able to find the then governor of Massachusetts' health record within an anonymized health data set, simply by using his date of birth, his gender, and his zip code. And you can see that this kind of targeted attack could be used by a political rival, by an ex-spouse, by a nosy neighbor, by a private investigator. All of these people might have or be able to gather the kind of information that would let them pick out someone's record within an anonymized data set. The bigger problem, well, another problem at least with targeted attacks, is that as more data becomes released, they can turn into broad attacks, the first kind. Targeted attacks depend on people having specialized information, right? But as more data becomes public and that becomes accessible to everyone, adversaries can chain together different data sets. And they can link all of that data together as long as there's some sort of identifier within each data set that points to the same person. Sweeney's re-identification of Welpton medical record is a basic example of this. She took his date of birth and gender and zip code from a public voter record, and she used that with the medical data set to find out what his record was. So turning now to some potential solutions, we think that a central component of any strategy to combat re-identification has to be shifting from penetrate and patch to something that we call provable privacy. Penetrate and patch, or ad hoc de-identification methods, are based on asking whether that method can withstand certain previous attacks that have already occurred, given the current data that's available. Provable privacy, on the other hand, is insisting upon affirmative evidence that the method can never leak the information except to some certain specification, regardless of what an attacker does. So penetrate and patch has been criticized rightly in the security realm because systems based on it tend to fail repeatedly. It's even worse than de-identification because data users have no incentive to do the patch. You have this data set, it has some privacy problem, but the patch data set is going to be no more useful to you. And so it's even less likely, because there's no personal incentive, that data users will change out that data set for a new, more privacy protecting one. In addition, risk calculations for ad hoc de-identification are based on assumptions about the knowledge and the capabilities of adversaries. But as I mentioned before, as you get more data in the public and you get better re-identification techniques, those assumptions become false, and the risk calculations that you have are no longer reliable. These vulnerabilities of de-identification call for a shift in the focus of data privacy. You want to define privacy rigorously and have data practices that are also designed to have provable levels of privacy. Right now, the only method that is well developed in this area is differential privacy, where there's the formal definition of including a particular user's data in a data set has to have a strictly limited effect on the outputs that you get as an analyst. Differential privacy algorithms add noise to the outputs of analysis typically, and they release the blurred outputs rather than releasing the input data or the unaltered output data. And then the effect of including a particular user's data can be made arbitrarily small by changing the type or size of the noise. Like any protective measure, differential privacy algorithms balance privacy and utility. So the stronger you make your privacy guarantees, the less accurate your estimated statistics will become. However, unlike with ad hoc de-identification, the trade-off between privacy and utility can be quantified here. It doesn't depend on these assumptions about what the adversary knows or what it can do. We think that further research is needed to develop and apply differential privacy and also to develop new provable privacy methods. Right now, the only real-world application of differential privacy is the Census Bureau's, the US Census Bureau's On the Map tool. And so additional work needs to be done not only to develop these methods that are practical, but also to achieve widespread adoption of those methods. Until provable privacy is the norm, we'll continue to have these unreliable risk calculations that get invalidated as times change and technologies change. As such, we believe that right now a form of the precautionary approach is the right course for evaluating data releases. So in general, the precautionary approach says that if there's a suspected risk of harm and an absence of scientific evidence or scientific consensus that an action is harmless, the person taking the action has the burden of proof to show that it's not harmful. Here, we're arguing for a weak version of the precautionary approach. So the idea of this burden shifting to the data releaser should guide policies that incentivize data custodians to be more cautious. Policy measures need to be tailored to particular data releases and types of data releases. And because of that, we don't recommend hardening the burden of proof into a single legal or regulatory requirement. Instead, we think the data custodians and policymakers should consider a number of questions: whether they can use a provable privacy method, whether their users are adequately informed about re-identification risks, whether data could be hosted on a custodian's system and queried by researchers instead of released, whether aggregated data could be useful, whether a limited release of data to certain people could be useful, and whether legal contracts, ethical training, or something like a contact information and statement of intended use could be required of data recipients. Obviously, these questions have different answers in different situations, and that's why we don't want to have a single hardline change in the legal rule. So, for example, in scientific research, the gains tend to come predominantly from scientists getting the data, and in that case, it makes sense to try to have a limited release of data, a restricted access to some sort of data sharing system. There, your system could provide a bunch of gatekeeping functions, so you can ask for proof of an academic position, or proof of peer review, or you could require ethical training. And generally, you could also make sure that that system is secure against attacks trying to steal the data. In contrast, you have data mining contests, which are usually trying to reach outside of traditional academia. And because of that, you want to cast your net wider in terms of your contestants. Still, Some of them could use provable privacy methods, and some of them could narrow the data release by having multi-stage processes, for example, where in the first stage, you get a limited amount of data, or you get synthetic data. And then if you do well in that stage, or if you sign a data use agreement or some combination of those things, you get a broader set of data in later stages in the contest. So we give more examples in the paper, and we hope that the ideas behind it and the suggestions there will be helpful for data custodians and policymakers when they're making these granular decisions about the risks and benefits of releasing specific data sets. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Questions? Yeah.
So, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, you seem to advertise differential privacy as the main example for provable privacy methods. But you also acknowledge that just because you show that something is provably private under this definition, that not necessarily tomorrow someone can come with more auxiliary data or smarter attack that would allow some sort of de-anonymization. And if I recall correctly, you say, well, yeah, some further research needs to be done in order to have better provably private methods. So my question is, do you really think that at some point there is this provable private method that will help us all? Or is it not a constant arms race between protecting mechanisms and attacks? And if that is the case, if not, the only really protection that you can get is to have a good agreement with the person that you share data.
So I do think that agreements are an important part of policy as a whole in this area, and having those sorts of legal agreements or other social agreements can be very important in protecting privacy of data releases. However, I probably didn't describe this in as much detail as I could. Differential privacy is different from these other types of data identification methods because the outputs that you get there can actually be shown. You can't get any more information from those outputs, and that's what's been proven. It's a little too in-depth, I think, to go into probably the 3 minutes I have for questions, but our point is that you can establish methods that no longer are in this arms race. Right now, with ad hoc de-identification, you're correct. We're in an arms race where re-identifiers and de-identifiers are sort of going ahead, and de-identifiers are always stuck behind because their data sets are already out there, right? And they're going to be vulnerable forever in the future, whereas the re-identifiers are getting better and better and keep relying on this historical archive of data that's released. So our point is to try to move to different methods where you get yourself out of that arms race, and you're able to show that yes, there are certain amounts of information that you can deduce from the outputs that you get from differential privacy, but you're never going to be able to deduce more than that.
Okay, I think we have to stop here, but there is plenty of time over the next 3 days to get back into discussions. I mean, that's also a big part of the conference. So I create some room to let people in. And close the door, please. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Lucile Owens. She's a PhD candidate at Columbia University, and she's going to talk about may I call it a new conceptualization, or thinking about a new conceptualization of privacy.
Hi everyone. As you can see, the name of the project, privacy is agency and the techno-social jurisdiction of the individual. So I was told that I could probably spend the entire 15 minutes I have here trying to explain what exactly that means, but I won't do that. I do want to say a little bit about it. So the overall theme of this project is that of reconceptualizing privacy, as I said. And I do this by theorizing about what exactly is the core of privacy. My claim right here, I sat next to a woman who wanted to ask me about my research. And I told her I'm a sociologist, I study privacy, and she said, oh, I I don't even know what privacy is anymore. And I said, yes, exactly. So what is privacy? What I think it is related to agency, or how we act in the world. So this is because whereas historical legal protections do exist to some extent to protect privacy, they are in actuality protecting the idea of an autonomous inner self. This is because our actions in the world are, if not wholly, at least partially, representative and predicated on the existence of an inner self. The existence of this inner self, its autonomy and freedom and responsibility to self and others, its agency, is what is essential to our experience as humans, and is implicit to how privacy is conceived of both legally and morally. Which brings me to the second piece of the title, the techno-social jurisdiction of the individual. So the experience of privacy has legal, political, cultural, and institutional preconditions, and is a function also of technological evolution. In order to unify the concept of privacy between both physical, social, and cyber-social spaces, the conceptual center of privacy is traced to the protection of the inner self, or the true and indivisible individual self from which social agency writ large springs. As reflected in the various nodes of the privacy right based in the American Constitution, as well as the moral and social norms that reflect and are reflected in the legal aspect. Following, the applicability of this paradigm is extrapolated to the new cyber-social spaces of the internet. My project begins to explain the legal with a gesture towards the moral conception of privacy, and the reasons why these are fundamentally changing with the new cyber-social world. As well, I intend to communicate a unified theory of the sociology of privacy that can be used as a basis for legal and political innovation. So that's the full thematic scope of my paper, but given our limited time, I do want to just concentrate on a specific point that I try to make in the project, and that is between the link between privacy, self-right, and ultimately agency of the social, moral, and legal types. So for the individual to be and act in the world as an individual self, she needs to experience privacy because privacy provides the greenhouse for self-determination. Privacy itself is not something experienced in a vacuum. In fact, it hinges on cultural, legal, architectural, technological, etc. features of the social world. All of these factors on which the notion or experience of privacy hinges on were originally manifested in physical social spaces. The internet adds a new spatial dimension to our social lives, which I call cyber-social space. Three vectors bear on the shrinkage of the notion and experience of privacy in social space. First, the national security state around the world, as well as corporations, are eager to gather more and more information about individuals and the many aspects of our mental, emotional health, and professional and social lives. Another vector comes from society that demands ever greater efficiency and safety, the provision of which, things such as law enforcement, surveillance of child pornography on the web, or better synchronization of public transportation services, rely on the internet and its technologies. Finally, there's a third vector that is increasingly through social networking platforms, individuals volunteer information about their mental, emotional, even intimate aspects of their lives. These are all compounded by advances in artificial intelligence, things like deep learning, facial recognition, even technology that recognizes expressions and micro-expressions of photos and videos. So we see that in cyber-social space, we begin to reveal part of our internal selves. Basically, the rules of these spaces are different than physical social spaces. Because the notion and experience of privacy is changing online by the force field created by these vectors, the question arises as to what the future is for the human self. For all the reasons just discussed, we are more and more inside the social world. Its presence is more constant, more available, more intense than it was before the accessibility of online social space. What are these spaces is an especially difficult question to answer given the non-traditional nature that causes people to question even whether these spaces are unique. Social interaction in these spaces are based in physical social spaces and mediated by machines. Their physicality sufficiently obscured to make people wonder where, in fact, actions have taken place. However, the structure of cyberspaces that facilitate online social interaction does warrant their consideration as distinct space. Your social actions there may complement or augment what is happening in physical social space, but they are taking place in a fundamentally different space. So, it is both a social fact and a normative choice that as individuals we enter into social space conceiving of ourselves as an I. For the self, for this I to be possible, we need the experience of having an inner and discrete moral life. In order to have that kind of experience, certain spatial, cultural, and technological preconditions must be obtained. But the force field, where the three vectors we discussed before interact, is changing the preconditions that I just mentioned. Therefore, given the changes, what is the fate of the social fact and normative aspiration that we start with? This concern is not only mine. I have here some research recently completed by the Pew Research Group in the US that asks the question, it's a word association. So what do you associate with privacy? We see words like safety, personal, keep to self, not for public. And these words are, almost without exception, linked to the concept of autonomous individuality or selfhood. This is selfhood as linked to privacy. Privacy concerns the individual self, where that self is no longer social, if you can think of the self removed from social space. What's more, we know already that privacy, even if not referred to explicitly, is necessary for selfhood. This has been discussed in literature across academic disciplines, from the time of the Stoics to more recently in the work of, for example, Julie Cohen at Georgetown Law Center. Privacy becomes more important for the self because social action, to a certain extent, is always constructed. As Erving Goffman would put it, we live by inference, which can be especially obvious given the often extraordinarily aspirational nature of certain interactions that take place online. Yet there's also a certain individual inner self that is capable of creativity or agency that currently does and must remain outside of this inferred social. As the social world grows larger and the private world shrinks, it is this core of privacy that must be preserved. The self requires privacy as the place of originality, subversion, creativity, and change. The concept of privacy has thus originated a diaspora, and this is reflected in both our legal and social understandings of privacy. I mentioned a few of these now, though I'm sure there are more, and you see an illustration of this here on the PowerPoint. My first example is of spatial privacy, which is afforded to us by virtue of being in legal terminology in our dwelling house, and it's the most intuitive notion of privacy. It's anchored in the social meanings and expectations attached to living in a house, to deserving reprieve from an at-large public or authoritative eye, by reason of securing through property acquisition or contract, for example, a lease, the exclusive use of a physical space. There is also, for example, a more abstract but by no means less powerful relationship privacy, afforded also by the law to those at one end of interpersonal relationships of intimate or professional types, such as familial dealings, business dealings, romantic relationships, caregiver-patient relationships, etc. These privacies are important in constitutional law, criminal procedure, health law, and the list goes on. As well, I see the existence of privacy of conscience. This type of privacy is important because we do not seem to only protect a freedom of religion or freedom of speech, but rather this privacy protects the instance of private decision-making that leads one to identify with a religion or specific words or moral actions. In all of these, it is not that action is protected in every or even the majority of circumstances by the state. It is rather that the ability of one to act as an agent in deciding this matter, the spirit of agential action, is protected. What seems to undergird these privacies is more fundamental. This is what I call fundamental privacy. It is the negative protection of fundamental privacy that has until this point defined it. The outerlying privacies, such as those I already discussed, have been conceptualized as a function of the fundamental privacy, the core definitional aspect of what is its mental locus and what is invisible to others, and in part to the person herself, as Freud has reminded us. Until and unless she acts out in the world in ways that reveal something about which was heretofore hidden from view. This is the privacy of the inner self that allows, ultimately, for individuation and the related processes of formation of moral self and legal personhood. Conceptually, privacy becomes the space of self-actualization. What all these types of laws based on these concepts do is to focus on one or more of these features of the experience of privacy, which of course are bound to change in time and space. But the fundamental concept of privacy is that of a barrier between the individual and the social that makes it intelligible for us to speak of an I, and of an I that can walk into the world as a social agent. As I mentioned earlier, given the limited time, I said that I would focus on only one aspect of the project. But I do want to end by sharing with you some of the further questions that I have, or that I am trying to answer as the project unfolds. So what is lost in this privacy diaspora is the understanding of what binds the concept of privacy together. So I think that this is the experience that you or an I that stands vis-a-vis the social, the singularity that stands across from the plurality. However, what has happened in the diaspora is a dilution in the force field created by the three vectors that we talked about. The diaspora of privacy is a dispersion of the conception of privacy that loses sight of the fundamental notion, and this dispersion in the force field created by the three vectors leads to a dilution. What I'm doing is going back to the fundamental notion of privacy to tell a story about what is at stake. On one hand, there's an immense freedom in the internet, or in cyber-social space. It's hard to think of the current social landscape without it. The social movements, electoral politics, and intimate relationships have changed incredibly. On the other hand, cyber-social space allows us to curate our lives for the viewings of others in many fora, both public fora and in private searches, musings, writings, readings, communications, connections, relationships, etc. Concurrently, an information-dependent public and corporate entities use the cyber-social platforms to mine, steal, and infiltrate information heretofore reserved to the private confines of one's own life. So the panopticon of the web does alter how we live, and in this new space and construction of the self, and how much this space influences the shape of moral selfhood and legal personhood within it, it doesn't just represent a subtle change.
Questions? Ivan.
I would like to concentrate on a very narrow part of this very rich paper, on the three factors. The national security state, the societal demand, the better law enforcement, and the social network, the data mining. I'm not quite sure whether the first two vectors are absolutely independent of each other, but if you use these three, let's say, independent vectors, are you able to illustrate in visual language, privacy situations, privacy demands, privacy values, privacy conflicts, or what? How can you map, or did you intend to illustrate in this virtual space the elements of privacy?
Sure, thank you for your question. So my project is in part descriptive, of course, as well as there's a normative aspect that I discussed. I think that the societal demand for data in law enforcement and others is different than the national security state, because if you can picture the vector, the national security state is extracting data from a population at large, and we see many policies that concentrate on that specific aspect, and concerns and advocates that are trying to change the way that data is extracted from the public at large. But we also see expectations within the public that are separate from that. So we expect data to be utilized by law enforcement in order to make the world a better place. Essentially, we expect certain aspects of our data to be employed in certain ways, even if it's not consciously, or even if we don't, as individuals, realize that that might be in conflict with the problem we have in the national security state.
May I add something? Maybe you have heard about a recently finished empirical survey which was conducted by a professional public opinion survey research company in the 27 member states of the EU. Survey, and it was about the perception of security, privacy, trust, and things like that. And it's very important. One of the most important findings of the survey was that in people's mind, at least in the European-wide pan-European environment, security and privacy are two absolutely independent values. To the contrary of generally security agencies and security people send to us, they always ask, how much would you sacrifice of your privacy in order to have more security? But if you don't ask like that, these are absolutely separate values that people want both. So people want both simultaneously. So how would you map this kind of independent values in the three vectors or in your whole concept?
So I think that is an excellent illustration of why we need sort of a new conception of privacy, why our old conceptions just are inadequate. So with the availability of these data, of how we interact socially, etc., there is this sort of disconnect between, and I think it also gets to appear between, what we expect in privacy and what we also expect in security. So. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Our final speaker is Christiana Markou, who's been here before. Last year she spoke about the right to be forgotten, and this year she picks on another grand theme within the data protection discourse, and that is cookie regulation. She is a lecturer at the European University in Cyprus, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and Ronald, thank you for all the work you are putting in this very special event. I have to warn you, as you can see, my presentation is about behavioral advertising, cookies, the relationship between the two, but most importantly, on the new, if it is still new, cookie law, specifically Article 5.3 of the Privacy Directive, which has been amended in 2009. I have 23 slides, and obviously I cannot go through all of them. I will need 45 minutes, and I have only 15, so get ready for a lot of slide skipping. I will tell you the basics in 1-2 minutes, and then I will proceed with the main point that I want to make today. So behavioral advertising, as you probably know, is advertising material that is not shown to everybody, regardless who they are or what they do. On the contrary, it's advertising that corresponds to the preferences, personal characteristics, and circumstances of the consumer to which it is shown. And how advertisers know about our personal circumstances and characteristics. They know by observing, monitoring our behavior online, which is evinced in the various clicks, page views, product searches, product purchases that we are conducting online. And this is where cookies come in. This is the main technology, at least for the time being, that assists in the collection of all this information about us, which is of course then analyzed. Knowledge about us is extracted, and that is how we have detailed consumer profiles which are used for the creation of behavioral advertising, which is also called targeted advertising or personalized advertising. So I will skip all of this and I will say that because behavioral advertising is associated with serious risks, mainly privacy-related ones, and if we take the definition of a different privacy cluster, namely informational privacy, we can understand why. Informational privacy is widely accepted to be the right of an individual to control the collection and use of information relating to him. And because this behavioral advertising presupposes the collection and use of information, often without the individual consenting to that or even knowing that, it is the privacy implications and issues associated with a particular practice are obvious. And of course, there are some other risks in one of the slides. So because of these issues associated with behavioral advertising, and the fact that it is quite a controversial practice, the use of cookies and other similar tracking technologies has been subject to legal regulation in the EU since 2002, specifically referring to cookies because an earlier directive is also relevant. So before 2009, Article 5.3 permitted the use of cookies by businesses, provided that they will let users know about the use of cookies, and provided also that they will offer to them the right to refuse cookies and the data collection that comes with it. So it was, sorry, there is some, okay. So that was, I'm talking about pre-2009. So it was, the use of cookies was being subjected to an opt-out approach. Businesses could freely use cookies unless users objected to them. So, what was the common way of compliance with that rule? Information about cookies was given. Only thing is that it was given in privacy policies, and the privacy policies were hidden behind tiny links at the very bottom of websites. And the right to refuse cookies was also given in a similar way in privacy policies and consistent of information on how users can set their browsers to reject cookies. Unsurprisingly, the particular provision was criticized for affording only insufficient protection. Very few people were reading privacy policies. Very few people were, in fact, been given the right to refuse cookies. So we had unfettered behavioral advertising. This freedom to collect information using cookies and other technologies resulted in the particular practice becoming widespread, and therefore the privacy-related concerns became louder, something that resulted in an amendment of the relevant rule in 2009. And as you can see, the new Article 5.3 now says that cookies cannot be used without the user consent, which may be given after the user is provided with information about cookies. So the main innovation, the key change is consent. We have a clear consent rule here, and that was a switch, a dramatic switch, from opt-out to an opt-in scheme in theory, because the question is what happened in practice. Businesses reacted very negatively to the new change, and I think that their reaction was and is very logical, because the default up until 2009 was free cookie use and free data collection. You might want to read, while I'm speaking, the words of Google director 8 years ago. So businesses were invested in data collection. They dreamed about being able to know even more about users. So it was only natural that a rule such as the new Article 5.3, which came to restrict this ability to collect data, was not welcome. I will very quickly say that I believe that their arguments against the opt-in scheme towards cookies are to a very large extent unfounded. Opt-in scheme doesn't really necessarily means repeated consent requests. Also some...
in 5 minutes, there's another session.
Also, they are emphasizing some very beneficial purposes of cookies, such as shopping cart cookies, remembering password cookies, authentication cookies, which are exempted from the requirement of consent anyway, so they are not right. And of course, advertising. This is a big issue. They are saying that behavioral advertising enables free content and services, but this is debatable, and it's not necessarily a valid argument, because data retention, for example, is also good to fight terrorism, but the European Court of Justice recently said that it meant an invasion, a disproportionate invasion to privacy. So this is a lot can be said about this argument, but fortunately I don't have time to do that. What I will say is this. If you have a look at how businesses now comply with the new rule, you will see, I haven't conducted a thorough study. I admit that I just checked some of the most major online businesses and saw how they sought to comply. If you start from the third one, one practice is they added a cookie policy link, tiny link next to the privacy policy, which will most probably have the same fate that privacy policies have. The second one from the end, they use a notice with very small font saying that we use cookies, learn more, with a link. And the first one, which is the closest to a consent rule as Article 5.3 now requires, is that they use a prominent notice. We have to admit that now notice about cookies have been improved. It is on top or at the bottom, and you can definitely see them. But what they are saying, basically, is that we use cookies, and if you don't like it, get out of here. So, and I think that it's really sad that the closest method, the method that is closest to the consent rule that we now have, Article 5.3, is this kind of, this way, this first one. And the question is, of course, why? Why Article 5.3? Why this major change, this major amendment, which was expected to bring a dramatic change in practice, has failed to do so? And of course, there was this strong business resistance. There was negative publicity. Indeed, the internet is full of news articles and blog posts making fun of the new rule. There was definitely, therefore, a hostile environment for the rule. But what I also believe is that the new rule was failed by the very people who were supposed to defend this rule. And this is, I will finish on this slide. I'm just listing examples illustrating this point of mine, that the rule was failed by officials who were not determined enough to insist in application and compliance with the new rule. And I'm putting here first a speech by Digital Agenda Commissioner in 2010, very soon after the new rule became law in 2009. One would expect a commissioner emphasizing the importance of privacy, the importance of having stronger protection, and the importance of complying with the new rule. Instead of that, we had a very industry-friendly speech praising behavioral advertising and quickly accepting industry arguments about consent, about the new rule requiring multiple consent requests. 1 month later, Communications Committee of the European Commission said that compliance with the rule was an issue for could be achieved by technical measures to be developed by self-regulation. And I agree with my colleague Eleni Costa, who said that these words by the Communications Committee of the European Commission were perceived by advertisers, by the industry, as softening the approach, and that was in 2010. We also have, at national level, things were not easy for the new rule. National parliaments, most of them, the vast majority, opted for a relaxed implementation of the new rule. Moments before the new rule was about to come into effect in 2011, all almost none of the member states in May 2011, because I know UK issued a guidance later in 2011, no member state, the national authorities, were ready with guidance on how to comply with it. The UK even postponed the application of the rule for 1 year, and other examples, but as you see, I need to finish there, that seem to show that there was a lack of determination on the part of EU and also national officials that led to the failure of the euro.
We have time for one quick question, I think. Brendan.
So, very interesting presentation, especially also how you explore towards the end of development and practice, because it seems like, you know, we introduced a fundamental change in our legislation, but in the end we just introduced annoyance for internet users. And so I follow you for I think all of it. The only question that I have is, are European regulators well positioned to question the freemium model of the internet? Right? Are they able to say, look, you have to be able to have your cake and eat it too. You have to be able to be on Facebook without being subject to the behavioral advertising. I mean, that's not necessarily a cookie question, but, you know, I mean, as a general matter, like, should we be able to have free content? And I mean, you made the point about the targeted advertising, which is not based on extensive past profiles, is also being a viable model. But I mean, as a website publisher, if I'm trying to generate some revenue through my site and I'm tracking people to my site and get some money off of that, the behavioral model is all that's available to me, I mean, to a large extent. So how do you deal with that?
Okay, so thank you about the question, because it gives me the opportunity to get to say talk a bit more about the advertising argument. I agree with you that this is a main argument that we are putting forward. The question is one thing is there are other advertising models that if they have to, they will explore and they will find ways. Contextual advertising, keyword advertising, and also there are presentations of systems that they go closer to personal advertising, but not in a privacy invasive way. So if they have to do it, they will do it. That is one thing. And the other thing is that we have to be a bit skeptical about these free content, free services. Are they really free? Because if we are paying for them with our personal data, we have to see and inquire a bit further into whether they are really free. And that returns to my next point, that they will have to work and invest in advertising systems that they will bring revenue, but respect the right effects.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. We have to shameless plug on my side. If you want to read more about regulatory failure and cookies, there is a paper written by Leenes and myself that is appearing now in the Computer Security Law Review that talks about the Dutch case, and that is a slightly different story than what Christiana talked about. The implementation in the Netherlands went into a different direction, although I totally agree that it is a regulatory failure in the end. And we also explore this level playing field advertising thing, because it's a business dilemma in the end. Okay, so thank you all.